That was an extraordinary introduction, and some of the introduction I was going to do, Pat already did. So I'm going to just change a little bit and say, today standing here, I'm riddled with a sense of time warp. All of the Kelsey Street Press members and the poets here, all of us sitting here on the panel are the vital fibers and connective tissues of my entire adult life for the last 40 years. And it's just very moving to be here. The very pink braided meander on the cover of this book was created by Richard Tuttle in his design of my poetry volume, Elevators. Just as Elijah Otis allowed us to lift our buildings and ourselves up into unoccupied air, Tuttle pushed the boundaries of a title across the border of a spine. The title begins on the back and finishes on the front. Tuttle pushed the notion of a title across this barrier, breaking all rules and previous notions of type and titles. As for the connective tissue, Richard Tuttle came to me through his wife, the poet mei-mei Rosenwasser. And I feel all the connections I've had with so many of the writers that we've published over the years, one connection brought on another connection, brought on another connection, in this kind of magical place. I met mei-mei Rosenwasser in the 80s. I just finished producing the first book that Kelsey Street did with Barbara Guest, and as soon as the book was done, and it was one of the last books we actually did where I set the type, it was called Musicality, and it was a collaboration with the artist June Pelter. As soon as I finished the book, she said, "Oh, you have to, you must deliver this to mei-mei." And I didn't know mei-mei, but I'd heard about mei-mei extensively from Barbara. Barbara would often talk about people just using their first names and tell you the most elaborate narratives as if you already knew them. So by the time I did deliver the book to mei-mei, I had just this complete, amazing narrative that Barbara had been telling me for months. And I was in Santa Fe to see the opera with my partner, Penny, and we had a drive to Galisteo, where mei-mei lived, and I got out of the car and I walked up this hill, and there was a barn, and I knocked on the door of the barn, and Richard was there doing some art, and I said, "Oh, where's mei-mei?" And he pointed up the hill, and I went up the hill and delivered the book. And from that day, mei-mei's become a very close friend, dear friend, and one of the poets we've done over the years. And her poetry to this day just always mesmerizes me. Anyway, so I also met Barbara Guest through Kathleen Fraser. Kathleen Fraser, this must have been in the early 80s, called me up. Oh,
she's in the second row.
Oh, there you are. Great. Kathleen Fraser called me up and said, "Can you give a lift to a poet I know who's coming to the city? She's going to a party at my house and is going to be talking about about HD." And I said, "Okay." And so I met Barbara that day, and by the time we'd driven home, I felt like I was just in some unbelievable reverie, and Barbara and I became very close from that day on. So I feel like, these incredible connective tissues in my life have been woven through these women, and who I've, met other poets through. Anyway. So I'm going to read from Elevators. I'm going to say a couple of things. I was born in New York City, and my love of art really evolved from my childhood there. And before working on this poem, I thought a lot about the history of the 20th century city and the history of New York. And as Patricia mentioned, there's a lot of quotes. There's quotes from Whitman, and there's quotes from Rem Koolhaas, Louis Sullivan, and Cass Gilbert. Okay. Elevators. Let's see if I can move this. Can you hear me now? Yeah, that's good. Elevators, skyscraper, fire-resistant steel. How I spent the afternoon turning Eiffel's bridge vertical. Possible plum, referent line. Call me the machine that makes the land pay. Or take the Rococo of Chrysler. Manhattan, the name perhaps a tall horse, or the uppermost sail of a ship. The border of Manhattan was born. The century begins here, and where will it end? The one thing that has changed quite a bit since I was young, I can no longer see. After the new one began, we were, I'll start this page again. The century begins here, and where will it end? After the new one began, we were delirious, and so we took to the train. It went as far as the follies of Luna Park. Coney Island is an island apart from Manhattan. Electric lights on Roebling's Bridge, the city. From the top, from above, we can see time ticking all the way to Canal Street. Everyone knows from above, from afar, order, trade, mathematical conjecture for more. Metropolis, Manhattan's grid, 13 avenues run up and down, 155 streets sweep across, pure potential. In fact, it is the most courageous act of prediction in Western civilization. The land it divides, unoccupied. The population it describes, conjectural. The buildings it locates, phantoms. The activities it frames, non-existent. In the harbor, every day was everywhere. Materials here, under your eye, shall change their shape as if by magic. Everything imagined was lit later, not now. How we took our measure of goods, machinery, steam. We're having, with latest connections, works the interdependent transportation of the world, this earth all spanned with iron rails, with lines of gridded steel, possible, possibly cabled. Otis, of course. The lift would hold all of us up, a height if you've got it right. Try me in the guise of the gauge, in excessive measures of coated steel. When my body goes up, everyone else is left behind. The century begins. Who's counting anyway? For Woolworth's sake, more floors than any before. Gild the Gothic with nickels and dimes. Tallest in the world, spandrels, pinnacles, and piers. The exterior thrust, floors, fabric, the infinite, taller than the gilded realms. Still the exterior surface, just a light skin. Precision, translucence, metaphysical urgency, my eye moving. Louis Sullivan leaps through clear grids, shimmering, horizontal, skeletal, vertical. How night, flickering light, city without limits. I was born. Pulling you, something, subterranean depth. I wanted to hold on to up, space of the future, new building, you stirring under the surface, last and lost, down pavement, concrete residuals. You want to go faster under the subway, senses flying forward, pictures moving, everything impossible, possibly so. You'd never seen a daily news. The interior is the city within the self. Who would have ever imagined an augmentation rising high, as if we had taken Coney Island home in our mind's eye? Forward was rushing up, and you would open the door of the caged elevator into imagined rooms, now more real than the Crystal Palace or the towers of a far-flung exposition. Was it Paris or Philadelphia? Had we walked the Elysian champs of that other city? Was it an ancienne ville or a simple burg? Eiffel imagines elevated places. For the first Universal Exposition, when they called on Gustave to build the tallest tower, how long did it take? Only 21 months to steal the show. Vertical leaps until Broad Street led to Broadway. And Ah So Simple, called Flatiron, has that just that perfect two streets come together and touch Like you, they have only 3 sides: industrial urgency, emergent iron, flags, little singer, wrought, cast of green sewing, a rat-tat-tat of machines sewing. When we roam our own Nouveau York, join me, let the platforms rise. Thank you.